we've had discussions around climate change and net zero dominating headlines in the run-up to the UK COP in 2021. Gosh, yeah, that's right. And of course, things have changed rapidly in terms of the energy crisis, what's been going on, the tragedy in Ukraine, and the fallout in terms of global energy prices and the impact it's particularly had here in the UK. But there are opportunities here as well amongst all the kind of debris of what's been going on in terms of the impacts on households and families and businesses. And that's how can we use the opportunity of a transition to a more modern energy system that's both cleaner and more affordable to households as part of the response to the energy crisis. And that's something we're going to turn to today. And I'm really delighted that we have a super excellent panel of speakers here today who can contribute their thoughts, which I'm sure you'll all, I'm particularly looking forward to. We've got around about 6 to 8 minutes per speaker, and then we have a fairly extended Q&A session afterwards, and we'll be taking questions both by roving mic here in the room and also by Slido as well. Okay, our speakers this morning, I'll just quickly run through them all before we turn to our talks. First, we have Juliet Phillips from the quite amazing think tank E3G. I've been following their work quite closely as they've expanded quite enormously and exponentially over the last few years. So I think you've got your new headquarters as well to try and accommodate the many policy analysts at E3G. So delighted that Juliet's here. Closer to home, we have Professor Martin Freer, who's the director of the Birmingham Energy Institute at the University of Birmingham. So I think you can add a particular colour in terms of a number of issues around decarbonisation of heat, but also some of the flavour from Birmingham. We're delighted to have Marcus Shepheard here, who's a senior analyst, I didn't get that right, at the Committee on Climate Change, and we'll be talking about the reduction of emissions from UK building stock, but also how can we achieve that goal when also responding to the energy crisis and the fuel poverty challenges that we have today. And our fourth and final speaker this morning, we're delighted to have from Denmark, Søren Jensen from the Danish Energy Agency. And as so often the case when we want to kind of look to other countries who've already been through the transition, who've made the hard decisions, several decades ago and have down that pathway. So we want some reflections on what's been happening in Denmark, but in particular, how some of the decarbonisation of heat strategies have unfolded in that country and what we can learn here in the UK. Okay, so a fairly packed agenda, lots to think about. I'm sure lots of questions that will be coming forward from you. So we'll turn to our first speaker, Juliet. Juliet, over to you.
Hi everyone, good morning. Brilliant to be here today. Thanks for having me and thanks for the warm introduction. Really topical issue, and I think one where there's growing consensus as well around the opportunities and benefits associated with a fair and affordable transition, but really importantly how we get this right so it really benefits those who are most vulnerable. And I think the gas crisis has really shone a light on the benefits of energy efficiency and the transition to clean heat. So digging into some of the statistics, Nesta have done some research which has shown that even with the current makeup of the electricity grid, heat pumps can reduce an average household demand for gas by 70%, and they're around 3 to 4 times more efficient than a gas boiler, so huge demand reduction benefits. Energy efficiency, there's lots of different stats around the benefits, but on average the estimates are around an economy-wide annual saving of around £10 billion associated with upgrading homes to EPC C or above, so enormous benefits there. And the government has recognised this. So last year we did see some progress. We saw an announcement that they were going to set up an energy efficiency task force. We saw the introduction of the 15% demand reduction target. And we saw £1 billion to a new eco scheme, Eco Plus. But I think after years of disorder on energy efficiency, there's still a few questions around how we're going to turn the boat around and actually deliver this on the ground. I'm really looking forward to the panel session later on where we'll dig into some of the challenges, shall we say, with delivering Eco 4. and how we can learn some lessons to make sure we don't face those with Eco Plus. And I think a really key lesson from that is listening to those who are actually on the ground, delivering and benefiting from those improvements. So as we move forward into hopefully what will be a year of delivery for energy efficiency and clean heat, I thought I would dive into maybe 3 thorny areas in terms of what we do next and how we make those changes affordable for all. So the first area is the private rented sector. The government consulted on tightening energy efficiency standards for the private rented sector, but has not released the results of that consultation. So at the moment, many millions of fuel-poor households living in the private rented sector are living in cold homes. And there's a challenge of a split incentive. So the landlord would be paying for the home improvements, and the tenant would be reaping those benefits from lower bills. So E3G is calling for those tightened standards to be introduced as consulted upon. And the current energy bill, which is going through Parliament, is a fantastic opportunity for the government to take a step forward here. We recognise there might be a need for a carrot as well as a stick, so we are saying there could be some kind of tax incentive for landlords, but we think this is one of the nettles that the government really needs to grasp this year to move forward. The second area I wanted to dive into is the postcode lottery facing many fuel-poor homes across the UK. So at the moment, due to the competitive nature of many funding schemes, like the Home Upgrade Grant, for example, across the UK, many, particularly rural fuel poor, don't necessarily have access to the grants, and it's basically, depending on whether your local authority has successfully bid or even applied for the grant schemes, whether you'll have access to that funding. This has to change if we're going to level up and make warm homes accessible and affordable for everyone. So another big ask from our side is for the government to change the nature of those funding pots and to make sure that everyone who needs it and is eligible has access to that funding. And then the third area is the future of heat. I think decarbonising heat is probably one of the areas where the UK is furthest behind the curve and has got quite a lot of making up to do. I do appreciate there's challenges, both with the upfront costs and the running costs of clean heat solutions like heat pumps. So this year, the government really needs to crack on with addressing these. Regarding the electricity costs, there's things we can do to decouple electricity prices from gas, and this will mean that we can reap the benefits of the lower running costs of renewables and make heat pumps more affordable. Regarding the upfront costs, we currently have the boiler upgrade scheme, which offers £5,000 or £6,000 off a heat pump, but we think there should be a rural uplift, so those living in larger homes, which might need a bit more money, are able to access that funding, and of course the full costs should be covered for those living in fuel poverty. And then final, slightly thorny area, I think, is the conversation around hydrogen and heat pumps. And E3G isn't anti-hydrogen at all. We think it's got a really important role to play in a net zero economy. But at the moment, it's not there at scale. It's not actually a viable solution. And we need to make sure this delay isn't preventing delivery of ready-to-go clean heat solutions like heat pumps. And we need to think strategically about where and where not hydrogen will make sense in a net zero economy. So there's some thorny questions the government needs to answer in some upcoming consultations around hydrogen-ready boilers. And I think this is an area where we'll need to put a bit more thinking in terms of the costs and the benefits for those in fuel poverty. So to wrap up, I think it's a really big year ahead. There's lots that we can be doing, and I think it's time to think big. We know that Labour is looking to spend £6 billion per year on home retrofits if they get into power. I think we've got some opportunities for really big blue sky thinking on how we can move forward to upgrade our homes and improve lives across the country. But we really need a laser-sharp parallel focus on effective delivery, so we're not repeating some of the mistakes of previous schemes of the past, and really moving forward, working really closely with those on the ground, installing these measures in our homes, but also, really importantly, those in fuel poverty who are actually going to be on the receiving end of these changes to make sure it works for everybody. So I'll wrap up there and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Juliet. It's quite amazing to think that even though we've had so much turmoil in Westminster, there is still so much policy going on around energy and so much to think about. That's a brilliant introduction to a whole range of issues that I'm sure we'll turn to during the Q&A session. Next up, we're delighted to have Professor Martin Freer, who's Director of the Birmingham Energy Institute. Martin.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Birmingham. If this is your first time in the city, sounds like, at least from the poll, that you've been enjoying it, and it's good that you're spending lots of money in the city that needs people to spend lots of money on it. So just to give you a bit of context and background, so obviously from the university and the Energy Institute in the university is a way of bringing together not just academics but a whole group of stakeholders to think about the challenges that we have within the city, within the region, and that's the West Midlands, the Midlands more widely, but nationally, internationally. I am from a part of the city which is some of the most underinvested in the whole country. So it's a part of the city which is East Birmingham. City Council has made it its priority for strategic investment, and the university has invested by creating a campus in this part of the city. And in fact, we have, in case you're interested, we have an energy park, and that energy park has a number of assets, including a monster energy from waste plant, which has large amounts of waste heat. We have a hydrogen refueling station. We have 20 hydrogen buses and a procurement process which is leading to another 120 hydrogen buses. We've got a biomass plant. We've got a platform for doing all sorts of things which seed this energy transition. So we're kind of living it in some ways, and we sit in a part of the country which has got its own district heating network. You might not know it from the temperature of this building, but we do have a heat network in the city which feeds many of the council buildings, the station as well. So wrestling with those kinds of challenges, and the development of Smithfield and HS2 will see extensions of that. And we have within the city quite large amounts of waste heat, large energy from waste plant. We have the biggest wastewater treatment plant in the country, Sewage Works, and that has huge amounts of waste heat, enough to heat about 70,000 homes. And the challenge that we have is really how to deploy those kinds of assets into real solutions. That's context. What I'm here to talk about really is a bit of policy work and policy thinking that we have done through various stages. The first was a piece of work with the CBI and Lord Billamoria, who was president of the CBI at that particular point, looking and thinking about the heat challenge. And then a subsequent piece of work which Peter from the NEA actually was the conscience, I would say, of the Policy Commission, keeping us on the straight and narrow. And that was thinking with Sir John Ahmed, who's chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, from a local perspective, how do we get some of this heat transition going? CBI 2020 brought us into the decade of delivery. We're 3 years into the decade of delivery, and it doesn't feel like we're delivering very much. And this, we should have kick-started this a long time ago. We still need to do some kick-starting, is my feeling. So, heat transition, what is the challenge and what do we need to do? What are the policy interventions? We've heard a little bit from Juliet what they might be. So if you think about heat and why has it been left to last, it is the most complex issue that we have in terms of the energy transition. Do we bother with hydrogen boilers, or we just go, well, we know how to do heat networks, we know how to do heat pumps, why don't we just get on and do this stuff and figure out how we do that? What is the local infrastructure and the planning that needs to sit behind that? If it is heat pumps, how on earth do we reinforce the grid to the point where we can actually deploy those heat pumps? Again, where's the investment? Where's the local planning which underpins that? And if we do want to go down that path, Where is all the electricity going to come from to power those heat pumps? We need a national plan. We do have a heat and building strategy, which Bayes kindly provided the thinking for. One would say it is hugely under ambitious, and it really doesn't amount properly to a strategy. Government needs a bit of a reset on this and needs some ambitious thinking. How do we catalyse the funding into the sector? We're told that there is a mountain of cash from private investment which is prepared to flow into this sector. How are we going to unlock that? Where is it? Where are consumers in this transition? Consumers, do we have that debate which everybody has a full understanding and buy-in into the needs of the energy transition? No, it's still hidden. So if government talks about the energy transition, they talk about electricity. We need a much more sophisticated debate. How are we going to scale up? If we do need 20 million heat pumps, where on earth are they coming from? There's a real danger that what's going to happen is that we're going to feed supply chains overseas, and it's not going to benefit the UK economy. So I could go on and on, but you see that there is a need for joined up coherent thinking, and there's a need to look at this through the lens of the communities who are at the very sharp end of fuel poverty. East Birmingham, as I said, where I spend a lot of my time, have some of the highest levels, in the top 6%, if you have a league table for these sorts of things in terms of fuel poverty, very high levels of unemployment, really poor housing stock. How do you get those communities to be at the front of the queue rather than the back of the queue in this energy transition? So John Ahmed's work and the Policy Commission, I can share the report with you if you so wish, has a very large number of recommendations. Some of them overlap with what we've just heard, but I'm just going to roll through 10, which I think are my top 10. So at the moment, funding is way too complicated, associated with access to or providing the net zero transition for people's homes. We could do better. We could bring it all together in one place so that if you are trying to do community by community and you've got a mix of social housing, private housing, that you can find a way of funding that through a single scheme. We are going to need that level of coherence. And Germany has a scheme called KfW, which has worked really successfully. We could emulate that. Amalgamate energy funding for energy efficiency and decarbonisation. Don't do them separately, bring them together. Number 3, ensure that this problem is owned locally and there is resource locally to deliver. So we have this mechanism of local area energy planning. Let's roll it out. Let's do it. And ensure that councils are properly resourced to be able to deliver. Let's stop dancing around gas boilers, and by 2035, let's have a mandate that there should be no further gas boilers. The Netherlands, they've made the commitment. Why can't we make the commitment? 2026, Netherlands. And then let's think about the markets. So lift, and it's, at the moment we've got an interim solution where we have lifted policy costs off electricity. We need to make electricity cheap enough that we can realise those full benefits that you've described. Why do we have an energy market where the marginal price of gas is setting the price of electricity? That's nuts. Why don't we decouple the price of gas from the price of electricity? EPCs, not fit for purpose, they need reform. Let's get on and do that. And let's be ambitious. Let's get on and do something at a real scale. So let's have some large-scale pathfinders, 10 to 20,000 scale This city here has held up 160,000 homes that it would like to have as part of a national pathfinder. Let's embrace the ambition of local authorities to really drive this and invest in them. And coordination is the last thing. We need a way of nationally coordinating this. We advocated for a national centre for decarbonisation of heat. And I have burnt way more than 6 minutes, sorry.
That was a great top 10 there, so I was desperately writing away. A fair few things we kind of saw in the Skidmore report last week as well, especially that focus on the local, but it was good that Martin also drew the lens back as well to look at the national coordination elements we really need to get all this working. Our next speaker is Marcus Shepheard, who is a senior analyst at the Committee on Climate Change. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you very much. Hi, it's as the others said, it's really great to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. So I'm going to deliver more of a sort of like a high-level overview of where we are and where we're going. So just stepping aside from the fuel price issue, in the past year what we've seen is the UK government transitioning from one that is trying to find its path to one that is more fully focused on delivering that pathway. And this is something that the CCC we are very supportive of. But our imperative now is that the government has, ensuring that the government has the adequate policies to deliver decarbonisation that will get us to net zero by 2050. So our sixth carbon budget pathways provide a benchmark of what we think is deliverable. And while the context has changed, we maintain that those are still eminently doable and very sort of robust guides to what is realistic. And the government has its own net zero strategy pathway, which provides a measure of their own ambition. And as Martin said, this could be higher, though I think we feel that the government has taken a step forward here compared to where it was, and we are now pushing them to go further, and we're using the pathway to hold them accountable for what they've said they want to deliver. But as noted, the context has changed in the past year, and we have been particularly focused over the past sort of 6 months on supporting the government as it grapples with the issue of the cost of energy. Our core of that advice has been that the government should go faster on energy efficiency in the near term. The value for money case of measures such as cavity wall insulation, loft insulation is stronger than ever. It's very much a no-brainer, and they pay off very quickly. However, we do recognise that even leaving aside the fuel poor in the wider owner-occupier sector, household finances are very stretched. People are not keen to take on new debt, and even where they are, options to do so are quite limited. So there are genuine and serious questions around who pays and ensuring fair support as we try to drive forward what is quite a rapid pace of change over the next 5-10 years. So how we're currently thinking about this is we don't see the crisis as a moment of opportunity. Rather, we feel that it reinforces an existing case for action that has been around for years. There is the need to get to net zero. That is a legal requirement. That's unambiguous. We need to address cold and hazardous homes. These, not only are obviously miserable for the people who live in them and somewhat shameful, they create, outsized burdens on the NHS and social care, and they provide, they create a direct barrier to us getting to the net zero target, which is our main focus. And obviously throughout this, there is a key need to support the fuel poor as we, move forward with decarbonising buildings. We are not focusing on a perpetually high gas price scenario. We're not in the business of forecasting, and I think it's a very tricky thing to sort of see our way through. But what we argue for is the importance of policies which provide resilience against price volatility. So we're not sure that sort of record high gas prices are going to stick around in perpetuity. But what we do think is that this sort of volatility in fuel costs will be the norm, and this is backed up by others such as the OBR and the Treasury. We anticipate this state lasting through probably 2028 at least. And so the rational response to this, in our view, is to focus on reducing energy waste. There are various ways to do this. There's fabric measures, but in the near term, behavioural measures are going to have the most impact and the easiest to adopt. And the government has taken steps to provide public information on things like this, drawing on resources such as, the analysis by Nesta and others, which Juliet alluded to. But the government has definitely been a follower rather than a leader here, and we noted that charities, media and others were out of the gates much quicker on this. And I think this reflects the inexplicably tricky politics of behavioural measures and energy efficiency more general, which is something that we have to work with within the sort of the wider scope of dealing with government. But we have seen other steps. There has been, more money for eco, and we have an energy efficiency task force that's been set up at the Treasury now. And while obviously the fund supplied is not enough to get us where we need, the direction of travel we think is broadly positive. Historically, the Treasury has been somewhat of a blocker to this and many other things. But this does indicate that the Treasury is starting to see energy efficiency and energy waste and actions to reduce that as something that is both within its interest and it is willing to take more decisive action on. I'd also like, as others have mentioned, to reflect on the Skidmore review, which we think brought a ton of useful recommendations to the fore. But I think one of the most profound ones and one of the most subtle ones is the call for longer term funding settlements for net zero, which is a significant break from the orthodoxy of sort of the past 10, 15 or more years, but is absolutely essential to provide that certainty, not just for fuel poor households, but for sort of, all homeowners as we try to sort of manage this transition. So what needs to get done? There's an awful lot to say here, but just to sort of try and keep it simple, the next 5 years are a critical period, particularly for energy efficiency. The transition to low carbon heat will take longer. That in our pathways rolls out throughout the sort of late 2020s and 2030s. But in order to create a good runway for low carbon heat, we want to get as many homes as possible up to a decent standard as soon as possible. And that's why in our balanced pathway, we expect around 85% of all the energy efficiency measures that get installed for net zero to be installed by around 2035. Annual installations will peak in about 2027 or 2028, depending on which of our pathways you look at. And that means over 1 million measures a year, cavity wall, lofts, underfloor, solid wall insulations, compared to sort of tens of thousands currently. So obviously there is a big ramp up, which is going to need substantial support from government in terms of policy, as well as new measures from the sort of wider private sector. But we do think these levels are deliverable. We maintain that our pathways are credible, and you only have to go back to 2012 to see that we were delivering 1.2 million homes getting measures in a given year, thanks to very generous government support. But to get there, we do need to address a set of key barriers. Obviously, the most critical of this is the question of finance, funding and affordability. Who pays for this is not a straightforward question, and there are not entirely good mechanisms in place to provide the finance for those who are nominally able to pay for the measures. But even where though people do have the resources, there are issues around supply chains, numbers of workers and skills, and the industrial capacity to deliver both energy efficiency and low carbon heat retrofits. There are issues at the local level around decision making and capabilities, as well as things like planning rules and how those are delivered. And there are also some systemic limitations, such as grid capacity, which obviously falls slightly outside the ambit of buildings policy, but is nonetheless a key obstacle that we have to address to make our homes low carbon and also just deliver the wider net zero agenda. So when we look at this, fundamentally in our analysis we've done, we believe that most homes can get to the standard needed for a fairly low cost, around £1,100. Our sixth carbon budget modelling thought that about 63% of homes could get there for that. But obviously that leaves the other 37% of homes who include predominantly many of the poorest households in this country, and they're the ones who need the most expensive interventions. So how we balance that, how we get momentum in the market, with the able to pay and the sort of the easier to treat homes, and then using that to sort of make approaches to insulating and improving the more vulnerable homes is definitely a tricky question, but it is one that we believe the government is grappling with and one we will continue to push them on. The government has pledged to fund this, but we believe that the pace could be faster and the methods of delivery could be improved. I think I'll draw a line there. I'm sure people will have tons of brilliant questions and I look forward to getting to them. So thank you very much for listening to me and on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Marcus. Reminded me again of that 2012 number of over 1 million energy efficiency, is that right? 1 million households. Households being treated for energy efficiency measures. And only this week we saw LSE Grantham make a report about the diminution in energy efficiency activity after the kind of green crap issue and the reduction in eco from 1.3 billion, as was at the time, down to 650 odd million, I think. So yeah, it really shows you that you kind of need government at the forefront to lead something you talked about to really kind of get the retrofit agenda going. Okay, let's move on swiftly to our final speaker for this morning's session. We're absolutely delighted here to have today Søren Jensen, advisor for the Danish Energy Agency. Søren, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be invited to speak here, and I'm also happy to see so many people. We also have fuel poverty in Denmark, but not at the scale as you have here in UK. And I will give you a little bit of background why that might be. Well, I've been asked to look back to the crisis from in the 70s, and then, well, I have to go through 50 years of experience, so I have 8 minutes. I have a problem, what I'm going to use the last 4 minutes for. But it'll be fast, so fasten your seatbelt, because now we take off. Okay, Kevin put it quite well yesterday. Never waste a good crisis. It's during crisis we actually think and try to do things better, and that's what we, I believe, constantly have done in Denmark. So in the 70s we faced the first real oil crisis, and we suddenly realized that we were dependent on not so nice countries, and that's more or less the situation today. At first we panicked, of course, but Danes are reasonable people. We sat down and say, well, we have to do something. And we made some strategies. We developed some strategies, but it sounds, well, straightforward, but actually it's trial. It has been trial and error. It has been a lot of faults. It has been bumps. But I'll tell you what we actually have achieved. So these strategies were for... Why it's not working? Yes, to get rid of oil, but today we use them for getting rid of Russian gas. Normally we are gas-producing countries, but our main platform are out for repair and will first come in again within a year. So that's a problem. I can speak for hours and hours and days, but I don't have that time. So I will only speak about energy efficiency and district heating. We call it district heating, you call it heating network here. It's not very reliable, this one. Okay, you have to look at the green curve, that's delivered energy to buildings. And you can see that just after the oil crisis from 75 to 82, we actually reduced energy demand quite much in buildings, 20%. But then from 82 to 2000, it seemed, well, we got lazy. Well, we have done what we could. We don't want to do anymore. Well, there is some explanation to this. The 80s, well, we still had a financial crisis, so people couldn't do that much. And even those who did it was more for comfort. So the energy saving was actually eating by a higher temperature in the house. So we did something, but not enough. Then we have a new crisis in the first of this century. Well, first we got to have more money in Denmark, but then we have the financial crisis. But even though we reached 12% in reduction of energy to houses, and you cannot see here, it's another graph now from 11, because that's what we have to report to the EU at that time. And then you can see at around 7, again the curve starts to decline, and even more in 18. I have to make also for 21 and 22. And again, it was a crisis. That was the climate crisis. Danes suddenly realized, okay, we are destroying the world. We need to do something, and I myself could do something with reducing my energy demand in my own home. And actually, in 99, we have a parliament election. We call it the climate election, because all the parties who didn't care about the climate, well, they are more or less diminished. It was only, they lost a lot of seats in the parliament. And for the building code, that has also followed. The yellow bar to the far left was for the first oil crisis, and you can see it has really gone down. And now the green one to the far right is what we call near zero energy buildings, and that's actually what have come to force this year in the new building code. And the blue one to the left is actually calculated in 2010 for all houses, buildings in Denmark, and you can see it's only half of what it was in the requirements in the building code and during the oil crisis. So, well, we have done something. So what it has already been stated that more efficient buildings are typically more healthy buildings. You improve the thermal envelope, you will get less mold growth, you have not radiation to cold surfaces. New windows and doors typically lead to less draft. And if you put in balanced mechanical ventilation, allergens are not very present inside the indoor climate because of filters. And bottom line, if you have an efficient house, then it's more cheap to keep it warm and comfortable. So going to district heating or heat network, you can see here that's the progress since the first oil crisis. Less than half had already district heating, but that was high temperature heating in the larger cities. But we made an effort to put more and more connect more and more to these district heating systems, and also establish new systems, and also lowering the forward temperature. So 2020, the energy mix was that 2/3 actually have district heating in Denmark. We still have a lot of gas. Well, we were a gas-producing country, so why not? We have not that many oil boilers yet, but now we want to get rid of all these boilers. We want to have either district heating or heat pumps, and we aim for 75% connected to district heating system, and the rest mainly heat pumps. And here, and it was slow to get rid of the boilers because, well, that's an expense. But now people are queuing up to get district heating. And why? Here, the top graph here, you see the price, the development in the price since August 21 to August 22. And what you can see that the gas price went up with 140%. So yes, I don't want a gas boiler. I have one. I don't like it, but I can first get connected to district heating in 28 at the first. But district heating, there was nearly no increase in the price. So that's really why people want to connect to district heating, and also I believe that's why we have less fuel poverty, but because many low-income people are living in areas with district heating, so they have not faced the same increase in the heating price as if you have a gas boiler. And the reason why is stated here. You can see to the far left, we started with a lot of oil in district heating, then we switched to coal, and then we got the gas, but gradually we are using more and more renewable energy and also from incineration, and we are using a lot of excess heat from industry. So we have a very when you have district heating, you can use different sources if you want to. And that allows you to switch between sources to always obtain the cheapest way of producing the heat. And one thing I have to point out, district heating are very heavily regulated in Denmark. You are not allowed to make a profit from district heating. So that means that all district heating systems are either owned by municipalities or they are cooperatives. So I was also asked to relate to what is going on in the UK, and I have been looking at the energy security bill that I believe you have discussed for many years now. Well, one good thing is that you are going to increase the rollout of district heating. I love that. And also there's consumer protection included. But yeah, I think there's too little focus on energy efficiency in buildings. And it's very paramount to understand you cannot have a district heating system that is efficient and cheap if the buildings connected to the district heating systems are poor and not efficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Søren, and thanks for joining us here on the top table, Martin. Well, we've gone through a whole number of issues here, and it's great to see that Slido has been so active as well during this session of speakers. Not surprisingly, a vast range of subjects there, and that's reflected in the questions as well. I will take a kind of an easy question for the chair, really, kind of warm us up at the beginning, at the outset of this Q&A session, I should say. We've got till 11 o'clock, so we've got 25 minutes. So one of the things that kind of one that's been upticked the most here is that, well, you know, some of the reports that Martin talked about, the routes that Søren has talked about, and the kind of findings that both Juliet and Marcus also reflected about, these have been circling for many, many years now. So how much real action is being taken? What do you think are the realistic and tangible steps that the government and other actors can take forward over the next 12 months? So what are some of the things actually in the next 12 months we really need to see? Martin, we'll work for the panel that way.
All right. So I agree with whoever expressed that sentiment. There's a lot of reports, and yes, guilty of adding to the pile of reports which have been created in this area. And reports are great, but we do need action. And I think we're kind of at a really interesting moment. So the report, the Chris Skidmore report, another report, it does provide us with a bit of a restart in thinking. I think the report that he has provided is very good thinking. The key ingredient here is going to be how does government respond to this, and how does the government look to implement actions. I have to say that around heat and buildings, I don't think government truly is the answer to this. It is a very complex problem, which is very much a local problem. We have very complex environment in terms of the buildings, the people, communities, and demographics, and that really the solution here is to look local. And if one looks at the combined authorities, and Andy Street in our case, local authorities, providing them with the tools that they need, the resource, the funding, continuity of funding. So let's get away from this stop-start in terms of funding. I see that actually that is the way forward. So we are at a moment where we are going through the devolution discussion. There are some trailblazer devolution deals to be done. I would love to see some of the opportunities to kickstart things wrapped up in the devo.
Well, my problem is, of course, that I'm not really into the real situation here in UK. Well, I'm in a center where we do government-to-government work, and I have given input to several calls from base, but I'm doing it the way that instead of saying what you need to do, I try to explain what we have done, and then of course you have to find your own path. But I'm very astonished what Marcus stated, that many buildings actually can be made quite much better for only £1,100. That's stunning. So if that's really correct, go for it. Don't hesitate.
Juliet.
Great question. And yeah, I totally agree. Going around in circles, I feel often when I'm refreshing my reports, it's a lot of copying and pasting because it's kind of revolving over same recommendations as last time, really. But in terms of like where we might actually see some progress this year, I would really hope to see some announcements on the things the government consulted on in the heat and building strategy. So private rented sector, tightening energy efficiency, as I mentioned, but also what we're going to do with off-grid homes who are currently using oil and LPG, when we're going to phase those out, and a whole raft of other things which was included in the heat and building strategy, which the government's gone quiet on. I think another big priority needs to be sorting out the current energy efficiency schemes. We hear from installers all the time about the challenges about Eco4 and Eco Plus, as well as some of the other schemes as well. So I think if we're not focusing on the nuts and bolts, we're really going to fall over when it comes to delivery. So I think that needs to be top of the list. Thinking more maybe big picture, I'd love to see the UK Infrastructure Bank really grasping energy efficiency this year. They got a strategic steer from the Chancellor last year saying you should go big on energy efficiency and clean heat. But so far we haven't really seen that much action. So I think hopefully this could be a year where we see some more ambitious thinking from the bank. Skills and training as well. We all know that we're going to need a whole army of heat pump installers if we're going to roll this out at scale, but the numbers are really, really low at the moment. So I think the government really needs to think about a long-term skills plan to get the qualified people across the country doing the jobs. And then finally, awareness raising and advice. I don't think we forget about the consumer in all of this, the actual household. It's very confusing at the moment. If you are inclined to retrofit your home, there's so much information out there. Who do you turn to? We need to sort that out. We need some kind of support system for homeowners so they know what step to take at the right time. So yeah, quite a long list of things, but they're all very important, I think.
I would just echo everything that's been said. I think the main things we're looking for in the next 12 months is right now the government, I feel, is very much focused on just getting through the winter, whether that's to do with energy prices or the NHS or a myriad of other challenges it's facing. And I think once we sort of are past the peak of that season, or out of the heating season in sort of April, there's a risk that the salience of some of these questions drops off, and I think we'll be very much focused on keeping this up as a priority and ensuring that the government uses that window it has over the summer to actually make some of these changes and really sort of put itself behind some of the improvements. I'd second what Juliet said about the UK Infrastructure Bank. The government loves to use the word unleashed, and the UKIB has 22 billion in capital that is there to be unleashed. But yes, it is definitely struggling right now just to sort of find good avenues to disperse those funds. So I think that's something where there are opportunities for programs and stuff to come up in the next 12 months, which could really tap into that and start doing stuff at scale. And I think the other thing is just in very practical terms, we'll have the energy bill come through. Hopefully that gets through government. It's a very big and comprehensive bill. It won't be the last energy bill we need. I mean, I think as soon as it passes, we'll start needing the next one. But within that, the government really needs to start, locking itself into some of the sort of the crunchier decisions that it's been dancing around for a while. So this is things like establishing how the market-based mechanism for low carbon heat will work, really committing, in legislative terms to some of these phase-out dates to send stronger market signals, and building that framework around a system of funding that can support the sort of the necessary measures we need to get us there.
Thank you, Mark. It's a kind of mix of short and somewhat longer things there if we turn to the energy bill, but it's good to see the work going through that. Buried away in the energy bill are things like a new hydrogen levy as well, going on consumers' bills. So there are all these things buried away there. Just two quick thoughts from me before we turn to a question to the audience. One is the point made by Martin about the kind of stop-start funding. I mean, I was listening last night to File on 4 Learning to Survive about Ingle Community Primary School in Preston, and Preston will be an area that's focused on one of the workout sessions where NEA has been working. But if you hadn't had a chance, and you probably wouldn't have been because you would have been at the dinner, I'd really recommend listening to on iPlayer the travails faced by that school as part of the cost of living crisis. And one of the big things was they said they can't heat their schools. They've got old boilers and they've got drafty windows. Government did, in December, provide a fund for schools to make energy efficiency measures, but they gave 3 months to spend the money and get the implementations in place. So that's a perfect example of trying to address an issue with a program which is just not practical. Just one other quick thought. My favourite read of the year, but I must get out a bit more, is the CCC's annual progress report published in June. It's where you find a really good summary of all the government's activities on low carbon and energy, and it's just telling that the government haven't responded to the CCC's progress report. They normally do in October of the same year, and we're here near the end of January and it's still not published. But yeah, do turn to that when it's finally published. Let's get a question from the audience, please. So if you could raise your hand, I will try my best to kind of see a raised hand. There's one there. Thank you very much. If you wouldn't mind standing for the panel, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, it's mainly for the climate change committee person. I don't know if you're aware, but my understanding is that on the high-rise retrofits following the Glenville tragedy, that the Treasury funding for that is so tight that if they accidentally increase the U value of the property at the same time, they're not eligible for the funding. And this seems to me like a missed opportunity. I wanted to put it up there because it's not relevant for everybody, but just thought I'd just highlight that to you. Maybe it's something you could look into.
Cheers, that's great. Sorry, and you are? Can you just say who you are, please?
Louise Shropsell from Groundwork South.
That's brilliant. That's a really interesting question about Grenfell and the whole issue of high-rise and retrofit. Mark, has any thoughts?
So I don't know the exact details of the cladding schemes. I do know that this is something that's been consuming a huge amount of energy and time at Duluck, often to the detriment of other issues that have been mentioned, such as EPC reform, which is necessary. But yeah, no, that's a really interesting point, and I'm happy to take that away or speak with you later and get a bit more of the detail on that. Thanks.
Cheers. Thanks for that question. One more question from the audience, if they're any there. If not, I'll turn to the kind of plentiful questions on Slido. Okay, that's fine. I'm not missing any hands there. Okay, another one of the ones that have been most upticked, and I think it's the core of what we're trying to address today at the NEA conferences. How do we ensure that we avoid leaving vulnerable consumers and households behind when transitioning to net zero? I mean, I think many of your organisations have been looking at this. So, Marcus, you want to go and we'll work down the panel this way, please?
Yeah, this is definitely something that is front of mind for us in all of our work. We ran a citizens panel with owner-occupiers, actually from hereabouts, earlier last year, and many interesting insights from that. But one of the key themes that came through for me was the issue of trust and sort of how even relatively well-off homeowners felt that they lacked a clear sense of where they could go for trusted advice, finding trusted traders and stuff like that. So there is clearly a gap in the information provision, which is made harder by the sort of the pace at which we need to deliver this change. 5 years to do millions of homes is pretty rapid, and it obviously creates space for abuse, whether that's sort of fraud or sort of misleading advice and stuff like that. I think this is one where, there has been fantastic work done by people like the Energy Savings Trust and Systems Advice, but ultimately government really has to sort of take a lead on that, both working at sort of 3 levels. Firstly, it needs to sort of tell the nation why this issue is important and why this action needs to be taken. We need to reduce our energy waste for purposes of energy security, for purposes of net zero, for purposes of just having a better standard of living. Then it needs to sort of work through sort of existing structures, whether that be local authorities, energy companies and others, to help people get access to information about sort of what actual changes they might make in their home. And then lastly, I think, there is action that probably has to be done more at the local level, and I think this is one area where the government needs to sort of provide both resources but more of like a steer to local governments to sort of really get on and sort of, a direction of sort of how they can provide advice around, like, where are the trusted traders in your area and stuff like that. This is obviously not a simple issue and there's no one solution to it, but really ultimately it comes back to sort of government setting the tone, seeing this as a priority and seeing, the vulnerable people, the most vulnerable among us as people who are going to need that additional support, that additional reassurance, and ensure that that information is accessible and available to them.
Juliet, you talked about the kind of patchwork of energy advice as well. So, that we have the government's new energy efficiency advice. I haven't tried it yet. I think I might do a cold call soon. But you go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think addressing the what I call the postcode lottery is so important, and it's not just about area, like you say. If it's, say, an online service, not everyone has access to the internet. Not everyone feels comfortable using the internet. So I do think we need to think about access in all sorts of different ways. It's not just always a regional thing, and different groups might have different challenges from an access perspective. So I think that's a really good point. And I think the lens of like affordability and accessibility is the way to best answer that question. And just also really wanted to highlight the fact it needs to be a dialogue as well with those who are kind of, most vulnerable, most affected. National Energy Action did a really good report on heat decarbonisation. How can we make sure fuel poor are positioned to benefit? And you just learn so much from hearing from these case studies, people who've actually, had a heat pump. What are the lessons we learn? Sometimes it's not the obvious stuff that you would think about. So, those would be the points I would raise.
Søren, do Danes just listen an awful lot more to local government, or is it municipal government who've been given more powers who can interface with communities better? How do you do it there?
Well, Danes are often claimed to be one of the happiest people in the world. And I believe that one of the things is that we complain a lot. But then we get rid of our frustration, and then we actually listen to government and municipalities. We trust. We have a lot of trust, not only in the public sector, but also among Danes. In Denmark, for several hundred years ago, we started this way of making corporations that went together to make a diary, went together to establish a grocery, and that's really down fundamental in the DNA of Danes. If we have a problem, we try to solve it ourselves, but we often discover, we can't, so we go together, and because we have trust. So that's I think different from the UK. But also who paid for the energy efficiency? Well, at the end of the day, we do it ourselves. But of course, some is taxpayer money, subsidies, but it has clearly not been enough. But people in Denmark are reasonable. They can say, okay, in the long run, it might pay off, or they say, well, I want a more comfy home, so I don't care about the payback time. So that's one of the reasons for for how it went this well. And also we have a quite welfare system. Until recently, we didn't know the term energy poverty, because that was okay. I cannot pay the bill if it's energy or it's the dental bill. It's the same. So you went to the municipality and have some support on that. So we look at things differently, and I think that what our main problem is in the we call it outskirt Denmark. It's a rural area where they have less income and so on, and they are off-grid. They don't have gas, so they have oil, and actually that's good at the moment. Oil are much cheaper than gas in Denmark at the moment, so they benefit. But the problem is for them to have a heat pump, because that's typically 3 times higher than getting a new boiler. But we have tried a new scheme. We haven't really seen how it will go with that, because now, due to the crisis, people don't care. I want a heat pump, no matter what it costs. But we have tried a scheme where you don't own the heat pump. It's an energy service company who have the heat pump. You pay for the delivered heat, you pay a fee for the maintenance, and you pay a sign-on fee that typically is 20 to 25% of what it costs to install a heat pump. And of course you say in the long run, okay, that will be more expensive because the company needs some profit. On the other hand, the companies are monitoring the heat pump, and they will optimize the running of the heat pump, because that increase their profit. So in the long run, I'm not sure that would be that more expensive for the house owner, but it's very easy to shift. Yeah. And you don't need to care of anything. If the heat pump breaks down, then you have a contract saying that the company needs to come and deliver a new one.
I think that's kind of reflecting a changing societal views about owning stuff and renting stuff, especially amongst younger people as well. So that's a good point.
And you have invented the phrase heat as a service.
Yeah. Martin, can you give us some flavour about that kind of aspect, probably from Birmingham? Because one of the things I think policymakers forget is the distributional impacts of some of their policies as well. Is there any kind of the work that you've been doing more locally, and you mentioned East Birmingham several times as being one of the kind of the most challenging parts of the country in terms of fuel poverty?
Yeah. So I think my conclusion is we should be Danish. Somehow there are countries way ahead of the curve on this, and seeing the story going back to the 1970s is a pretty powerful one, that the UK has kind of dallied around this or dithered around this for way too long. My deep concern is that this heat transition that we'll go through, energy efficiency transition, will be a middle class transition, and the more affluent, they will just keep paying their energy bills, they don't really notice, and those who are in fuel poverty and social deprivation will just be left behind. And I think we have this moment, so there is an energy crisis, and you can use a crisis to benefit. We have a moment where actually this is a point where you can do the market building through delivery of programs targeting those in social housing, those in fuel poverty first, generating scale of activity there which drives down costs, brings a sector together. So I think actually community-led projects, bringing the community together, getting them to lead activity, do the proper thinking, work hand in hand with local government is the way forward, and targeting public funding at that sector and getting the heat transition there first is the way to go.
I'm the chair of Community Energy London. I'm constantly amazed by the group's ambition to want to do more and more complex and ambitious projects. But increasingly, as we're seeing some more money coming from government for a number of different programs, we're seeing local authority officers just not having the ability to get that money out the door fast enough. Importantly, work with households when things go wrong. And I think that community energy element really has been worked upon. And just to remind everybody, there is no community energy strategy. There are no incentives to help community energy groups at all. There is no policy around community energy at all. It's completely devoid from where we were 6-7 years ago. We're running close to time now. A quick thing which I can see that Fraser from Energy Action Scotland has asked, and I'll try to broaden the question, but we are potentially going to see lots of kit going in as part of the energy and green transition. So people in their streets, in neighbourhoods, in their community buildings, they're going to see roads kind of like dug up. They're going to be inconvenienced when they've been decanted from houses. So one of the things is, if we're introducing this stuff into local areas, should people benefit in some way by bits of being inconvenienced by bits of stuff being in their proximity of their local area? You know, do we need to kind of address this issue of NIMBYism, that often talked about in terms of energy from waste, but has gone to onshore wind, but it will probably come to local households as you look at substations or heat networks or and so on and so forth. So how can we get the community involved in not only the decision making, but benefiting? Martin?
I think it's going to be a real challenge, actually. And we've seen some of it around the hydrogen demonstration program, haven't we? So that there you've got a test of rollout of hydrogen for heat, and you can see the pushback that people have given around something which is fairly straightforward and should be positive. I again strongly believe that what we need is a national conversation where people are completely bought in that we've got to do something, folks. We're all in this together. Yes, there's going to be some inconvenience to you. Yes, there's going to be some cost, but this is part of a transition. So it would be being more Danish, being more European, being more community orientated, and sharing the transition, sharing the journey.
I mean, Søren, in Denmark, you build ski slopes on energy from waste plants to try and bring in new amenities. So do we need to be a bit more creative as well?
Well, yeah, only one. And now it's worn down, the ski slopes, and nobody wants to pay for it. So, yeah. But actually in the 80s, when we rolled out gas and district heating, it was stated that if there was coming district heating, you have to connect.
Yeah.
Now we don't need it anymore, but at that time you had to, and then no discussion.
Yeah, and in the energy bill we've actually got the introduction of new powers here, some 50 years after Denmark, to try and do something similar. How fast it rolls out is another question. Juliet?
Yeah, great question. I think what's called the hassle factor can be a huge barrier. So we do need to think about ways to address it. I think there's the stick. We can introduce regulations. There's the carrot. We can have some subsidies. We can have some sweeteners to make the deal a bit better. There's also information and awareness raising. So I think when people realise the benefits, they'll have warmer homes, which cost less to run. Hopefully they might be a bit more amenable to a few short-term inconveniences. But just kind of thinking bigger picture, at the moment, we already have a lot of disruption. When I was living in a block of flats, we had scaffolding up for about, I don't know, what felt like about 3 months for the gasworks, and no one really questions that. So maybe like over time, we will get more accustomed and accepting of those changes.
Yeah. Marcus?
I don't know what to say about things like, people being able to reap the benefits of being nearer sources of generation. I think that's a very complex issue that I just don't have any thoughts on. One thing I do think, though, is I think the government could, needs to take a stronger stance and start to shrink the space of like what people should expect. I think to a certain extent this is presented as like a true consumer proposition, in the same way that, like, if you want to buy an electric vehicle, you can choose a BMW or a Mercedes, and you can choose a big car or a small car. Whereas in reality, with heat, the consumer proposition is different. You're not going to be able to be like, well, I want to be on hydrogen, but my neighbour wants a heat pump, and Mrs. Miggins 3 doors down is going to be on district heating. You know, people are going to be, by virtue of where they are, sort of, nudged or sort of obligated into a particular type of heating system. And I think it is incumbent on the government to ensure that, the best option is available to the people in each area, but that is also, clearly communicated so people understand what they're getting and feel like they're not being, shortchanged or left out or being boxed into a poor option. And I think this is an area where the government both needs to sort of take some sort of difficult decisions and sort of actually place its marker down, while also sort of building an evidence base that it can use to sort of reassure people around, the sort of the benefits, the safety case and stuff like that.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. I mean, I'm a glass half full person. I've been encouraged by lots of the conversations I've had at the kind of community level and being involved in some of the city assembly work, the climate assembly work in London boroughs. I mean, if you set out what the challenges are, what the benefits are, what the timescales are, and what some of the kind of co-benefits are, from green spaces to health to air quality, by and large, communities are actually really, really supportive of these measures, but they want to feel like they have some ownership in terms of the direction of travel, not it simply being done to them. And I think all too often, the kind of edicts and policies coming down from government is about things being done to them. I know I'm still not quite sure many communities be wanting a small modular nuclear reactor on their doorstep. But there are lots of things that we've talked about today which are immensely practical, things that we could have been doing for decades and things we really need to get, put the foot down the pedal to kind of move on. I must have a new analogy to that foot and pedal thing. Okay.